whatever the title was for a period, was actually the number one person at the IMF. There were some transitions going, so he moved from being deputy to actually running the whole thing. He also was vice chair at JP Morgan. He also was, as well as being vice chair, he also was chief economist at JP Morgan, and has been in the world of finance at the highest level, starting at Salomon Brothers, all the way to where he is now. But he's one of the most thoughtful people. He is leading what's going on at Bretton Woods. He's leading he's involved with SIZE, which is doing a lot of work. By the way, those of you who don't know, they have a new building, the Bloomberg building down near the National Gallery. But incredible experience. But both of them, I think, worked at one point together. Also delighted to introduce Liaquat Ahamed. It's great to get Liaquat because he used to live in DC for a moment, and he has now transplanted to California. And it is very difficult since then to get him here. So you all made it possible. So I'm very glad. We have our advisory board meeting this afternoon. So he did come up for that, and we're grateful. Liaquat, I will start at the other end, is the author of Pulitzer-winning book, Lords of Finance. I'm sure all of you know about Lords of Finance. He wrote about central bank governors during a very stressful period, and so as you can imagine, we can all fill the void of Alan Greenspan in today's meeting. It's the first RockCreek advisory board meeting that Alan Greenspan is not in person. And so they became really good friends, and I think Liaquat has interviewed every single Fed chairman since then. Every time that like Bernanke wanted to be interviewed, he'd say, "I only will be interviewed by Liaquat." Janet Yellen, the same thing. He and Jay know each other. So he also, for a moment or two, was running the World Bank's trading investments on the non-US side and global side. And also Fisher Francis, Trees and Watts, which was the fixed income firm. He went in there, and then he eventually was running the whole thing before he decided it's time to move on and do some good with his writing and thinking and all the other things he's been doing. Last but not least is our very good friend, Laura Tyson. I've been honored to know Laura for many, many years. We both don't use the year that we met. Just to do too much information. As you know, Laura is one of the most eminent economists in the United States, was economic advisor to President Clinton, continues to be economic advisor to many people like Al Gore and to, right now, Governor Newsom. So she's involved at a global, national, and local level, and a community level, in policy making. And putting that aside, she has been dean of the Haas School, the business school at Berkeley, dean of also the London Business School, and in addition to that, she's been on multiple boards of Morgan Stanley, CBRE, AT&T, and through all of them, she's always been a leader. Like if you met the management, they would say what a big impact she's had. At RockCreek, she's had a huge impact. The reason being that our interests in a lot of impactful areas coincide. And she has always been about how can you make impactful investments sustainable, which means they have to have the highest returns. So that is only one of the things she writes and thinks about. And if you look at Morgan Stanley, and they started doing a lot of work on sustainability, Detroit ran all of that. That was thanks to Laura, among many other things. So with that said, I'm going to pass it on to Caroline. She's going to moderate this session, and just wanted to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you. On a Friday, too.
Yes, as I got a cab this morning, the guy commented that the traffic was very light and easy on a Friday these days. So I echo Afsane's comments. We're going to have a moderated discussion. Nobody's going to give long speeches, and then we'll have time for questions, both from those of you in the audience and also on Zoom if you want to. And I want to start off, we've had a lot of information and changes about the US economy in recent days, but I want to start off with a slightly bigger picture question. And I'm going to go to Laura first, which is, what's your biggest worry about the global economy? What's the tail risk that we may not be thinking about right away? And is it homegrown in the US? Is it geopolitical in nature? Is it, or is everything going to go along fine, as it seems to have been doing since COVID in the US economy?
I'm going to say my tail risk concerns are political and geopolitical. I noted as I was walking down the hallway on the CNN screen, story in the Wall Street Journal about how if Trump is elected, he wants to basically take away the independence of the Federal Reserve. And that's part of his plan. So basically, that's a tail risk. I will let Michael Veslov talk about the tail risk associated with Trump being president, but I'm saying a tail risk is undermining of the Federal Reserve. Another thing that I will say, geopolitical, is that the president has the authority to essentially, if he wants, or she wants, slap 50% tariffs on China, 10% tariffs across the board. That's another thing that's being proposed. So that, in terms of inflation, in terms of price rises, in terms of cost rises, in terms of making the US less competitive as a place, because all the supply chain that comes in would have those imports, it could actually end up, as tariffs often do, strengthening the dollar, which then will depress exports. So it's actually an inflation depressing set of policies if those tariffs go into effect. The president has the authority to do it, and he has said, that candidate Trump has said he will do it. So.
Thanks. That's certainly two big economic things to worry about. I want to ask Liaquat to comment on that, and maybe you have other concerns, but given your background, maybe you can also say, why is it the markets don't seem concerned about those scary geopolitical risks and political risks? Is it just that it's too hard to price? Or is it that, in the end, yes, terrible things happen in the world, and actually the US stock market at any rate goes on going up?
So, actually, do I need this? I do. Okay. So, I used to be a bond trader, and I always think the bond market is much smarter than the equity market.
Of course.
And we used to have this sort of a rule of thumb that the UK was always a great forecaster of what was going to happen in the US. And I think what you saw when Liz Truss tried her little antics is a precursor to what may happen here. That I think we are getting a situation where the bond market is getting repriced. That the supply-demand dynamics have totally changed. There isn't a buyer of first resort or last resort in the US anymore. It was for the decade of the 2000s and maybe the 1990s, foreign central banks. It has, for the last 10 years, it's been the Fed. Both of those are getting out of the business. So I think we could get a return of the bond vigilantes, which could cause a major repricing of where interest rates, long-term interest rates are. And I think combine that with the fear of the sort of things that Laura was talking about, a sort of over-inflationary policy associated with presumably a Trump administration, but maybe also with a Democratic administration, poses the biggest macro risk to me.
Thanks. And for those of you, I'm sure you do all remember about Liz Truss's antics, but for those of you who may not, what happened was that she announced, and her chancellor announced, some very expansionary policies at just the right moment. And when everybody, or the wrong moment, when everyone was concerned about inflation, and you had a shortage of buyers of UK bonds and a rapid rise in interest rates that then triggered a lot of incipient problems in the bond market and in the pensions market and insurance market. And the Bank of England stepped in, and she stepped down. John, do you want to maybe pull out a bit to not the geopolitical so much, but the international economic issues, and what worries you most?
Yes. Now, I have a principle that you're rarely seriously hurt by the things you've been worried about.
Yeah.
It's the stuff you take for granted that gets you in real trouble. So I've been trying to think that way. Just add, it seems to me that there were three things that are really critical here and underlay what we've heard. One is the outlook for inflation. The market, not just investors, officials, etc., obviously have had a very hard time not only predicting inflation, but really understanding the whole process of price formation. So underneath this all is a lot of uncertainty, intellectual uncertainty about, do we really understand this process well and can predict it and therefore control it? So this is an area that I think about, and I still tend to think, although you can build risk cases other ways, I still tend to think that the story is disinflationary. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about global growth. The IMF's latest forecast, which is a consensus forecast, but it doesn't mean it's wrong, is that the next 5 years is essentially going to be some of the slowest years of global growth, the slowest extended period of global growth in decades, which ought to be disinflationary. Also, I have no idea what really would happen in a Trump administration, but what I've been reading is that if there's planning that's going on, and obviously the idea that the White House would issue instructions to the Federal Reserve is very unsettling. That's how it used to be done in England, and back when England used to be known as very inflationary, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But that the plans are a substantial reduction in the scope and scale of the federal government.
Federal government, right.
That's in other words, following the latest Argentine model. Is that possible? And if so, what would that mean? That's a risk I think people haven't really thought about. But once again, I would imagine in the short run would be, on the one hand, increase uncertainty, but ought to also be disinflationary. And the other aspect is something that this group has talked about, I've talked about. The last time we had a crisis, i.e. the global financial crisis, we're accepting COVID, the last financial crisis, there was no sense of great power conflict in searching for solutions, for collaborative solutions. And it's hard to know if there were a challenge, would once again the principal economies decide, as they did in 2008, 9, 10, if we don't hang together, surely we will hang separately? Or would the national interests or regional interests or allied interests trump the common good? These are the things I worry about. In essence, to me, these are skewed towards slower growth and disinflation. Yeah.
So, Liaquat, I want to pick up on what this means to emerging markets. And I have to agree with John. I well remember being at the IMF and then in the White House when there was the Euro crisis. My Chinese counterparts would privately be calling to say, are you guys, i.e. the US, going to fix this Euro crisis? Are you engaging? Because they didn't feel that they had the contacts and so on, but they were clearly indicating that they wanted to be helpful. And I think it's a very good question to wonder now, would some people say tripolar world, China on one side, the US on another and its allies, and then a group of non-aligned, including India, Brazil, Indonesia, where would these countries fall out, and what would and would that matter in the case of a financial crisis?
So I cannot claim to be an expert on emerging market debt, and I'm sure there's a incipient emerging market debt crisis or problem coming out, and one of the big culprits, I get the impression, is China. That they've been actually surprisingly insensitive to the chance of such a problem, and not very helpful in finding a solution. So that's my 2 cents. I not informed by any sort of analysis. Going back to what John was saying, I think the great power conflict will be particularly bad between the U.S. and China. Yeah. That is a situation where the Chinese do have some weapons, and that is their giant holdings of treasuries and their willingness to employ that as a tool to put pressure on the U.S.
Right. So, Laura, I see you agreeing with that on China, and I would like to turn to China. I'm kind of saving up the U.S. as the biggest, as the gorilla in the room, the U.S. economy. But on the Chinese economy, we've heard a lot about how they want to stimulate the economy. There are really different views, I think, amongst analysts of, China's not growing as fast as it was, but it's still growing quite rapidly, and that's what will continue to be an important power. And then other people who feel that this administration and President Xi's focus on control and party control and state enterprises, again, is really going to hobble China for the longer term economic growth. So I'd be interested in your take.
I think both things are true. Okay, so the macroeconomic challenges which China faces, even if Xi were not pursuing this statist policy, those are challenges which are severe and will keep China's. They're on the brink of essentially a kind of housing financial crisis that we lived through, and I think they're going to have to try to deal with. They're going to have to deal with that. Okay, and I can't say exactly how, but I think that clouds the macro picture for China for quite some time. On the other hand, I would say I'm of the view that I think 11% growth year after year was not going to be sustained. A 4 or 5% growth rate seems sensible given the demographics and given where China is today in terms of global markets. So I think that's okay. I think they got a kind of problem of getting through the current mess, but I think if they end up in 4 to 5, and I think 4 to 5 is consistent with Xi's policies. I think what those policies are doing is discouraging a lot of foreign investment in China. That's been an important engine of Chinese economic development. That's not going to be the case anymore. Firms are pulling out. But I tend to think that if you look at their technology support policies and their sort of industrial policies to support technological change, look, there are only 2 serious powers in the world in AI, and it's China and the U.S. And then the U.S. says, well, they're a year or 2 behind. I mean, that we continue to say that, by the way. So if you listen to the administration, they'll say, well, we're trying, by keeping this stuff out, we're trying to keep them 2 years behind. I think, forget it. I think that all that does is it actually speeds up the process of their getting to close the gap. So in that sense, I think the statist policies of Xi, except for discouraging foreign investment and innovation that way, I think they have a set of tools, and I think they will continue to use them.
Yeah, John.
And just to say, couldn't forget again on climate, we kind of know. So for the U.S. right now and for the world, China did a lot of support to build the components of the green energy supply chain. They have it. They're there. They are cost competitive. They scaled it. And now the question for the U.S. is going to be, well, geopolitically, we don't want to buy any of that stuff. Even though it exists and it's very cost competitive and it works, we don't want to buy any of this stuff. And I think the Europeans are going to take a different view. I think they're buying it. And that's just in terms of, say, the electric vehicles and BYD, they're buying them.
That's very interesting. And on the Europeans, I think they will be heavily influenced, at least Germany will be heavily influenced by their existing auto industry, which is sort of close to the heart and soul of Germany and not very advanced at all towards EVs, and have German former colleagues who say, you know, ICE, internal combustion engines, really the best thing that was ever invented, and we're still making them, and everybody still wants German cars. So I think it will take them a while to catch up. But John,
Yeah, just a couple remarks. It's notable that, as Laura suggested, some of the people who are extremely well informed on China, who are China specialists, who I respect greatly, some are quite optimistic, at least about the medium term. Others are quite pessimistic. So I don't know, but I was I was there in November in China, and a couple observations. And we all know that in the medium term, that strengthening the Chinese economy or to sustain strength in the Chinese economy is going to require a shift away from reliance on exports and toward domestic demand, especially consumption. And the authorities say that as well. There's no argument that needs to be done. My two observations, perhaps of interest. One, I hadn't realized the degree to which expats had left China during COVID, and they're not going back. They're not going back. So, and let's call it at the ground level, at my level, not the head of government level. At my level, the response, I was very struck. It was, "We're so glad to see you. Thank you for coming." It was underlying. It was a rather different view than you might have expected. Secondly, the problem they have, big problem, is a very palpable loss of private sector confidence in China, Chinese private sector. Chinese private sector. So the conclusion of the folks that I was with was that the near-term outlook is probably not so bad because, as Laura says, they've got lots of tools to deal with the short run. But the medium term, they got to fix that. Okay. And without getting too specific, let's just say, I attended an event where a very senior official gave a speech about how much they love the private sector. And my antenna were, the more this fellow spoke, you get the idea.
he thinks he was protesting too much.
I'm not sure everybody ran out to invest there. Anyway, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. And Laura raised an important question. If China is willing to subsidize the rest of the world's green investment, for example, by selling us things at a loss, should we accept it, or is it in our interest to say thank you very much, but no?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And of course, we've got a session on the energy transition that I'm sure will delve deep into that. I think that's a really good question. And this administration has made up its mind in one direction, it would seem, including Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. I wonder if, I suspect that the greeting that you got, the welcome greeting that you got, might not be being handed out to Secretary Blinken, who's I think today meeting with President Xi. Although he is getting a meeting with the Chinese president, which I think is very important because it certainly seems as if there is some desire to lower tensions. That seems to me the most difficult issue actually between them is China's support of Russia in Ukraine, because that is really striking very much at today's national security interests for the US. But Liaquat, I'd like to turn to you about the Chinese economy and relations with the US. After all, it's the second biggest economy in the world, and they have taken, for 10, 15 years, we've heard about how there's recognition of the importance of boosting consumer spending, know that the relying on investment model can't go on forever, and yet there's very reluctant to spend money to support the consumer, and now you have the housing finance problem that Laura mentioned.
So I don't, first of all, I don't buy the Chinese 4 to 5% growth.
Okay.
I'm not sure why, but I'm convinced the numbers are much, much lower. Secondly, I think the combination of the two things, a macroeconomic strategy that has run out of steam, and the heavy hand of the central government and the frightening of the private sector is a recipe for turmoil. And I don't see how they've protested that they keep on saying, we understand we have to rebalance the economy, and nothing happens. So I have no insight into why not, but there's something that's gumming up the wheels, and I see no sign that that's changing.
John, you've spent a long time, or you did spend, especially when you were at the IMF perhaps, and it sounds as still, trying to puzzle out how real are the data, can we trust the numbers, what's really happening to the economy. So do you agree that 4 to 5 is way too optimistic?
It sounds optimistic in a situation in which the labor force is shrinking.
Yes.
And investment doesn't seem to be going to its most effective use. For some time, China has been investing virtually double percentage of GDP than anybody else, and their growth rates have slowed to really sort of average for emerging markets. So you don't need a PhD to figure out they're not making very efficient use of their invested capital. So that sounds like, and we can see where the problems are. So it sounds like it's going to be tough. As I said, I came away from the trip feeling short run they got things to keep things under control. What the right number is, I don't know.
Right, sure.
But medium term they have real issues. And
yeah, I'd like to go back to Laura and just say, okay. I'm sorry.
No.
Please.
The one thing I want, the two things to add. One is it will be interesting to see, of course, if China is no longer viewed as an economic miracle worker or even a powerhouse, but one that is struggling with its own domestic situation, what is the geopolitical implication of that going to be? I think that's pretty important. And secondly, I assume we'll come back to emerging market debt and talk about China and debt restructuring, et cetera, because I think there's some issues there. Yes.
Well, Laura, do you want to pick up on that? And I was also going to ask you how you would answer the question of should the US be taking this small yard high fence approach against technology transfer, or should we just understand that the world is an integrated and complicated place, and actually we don't want to keep out Chinese goods?
I think we're trying to have a small yard high fence just for China. We're not trying to do that in general, okay? So I think importing technology and high-end, importing or being in the supply chain for advanced manufacturing of chips using the Netherlands firm, we're fine with that, okay? We're fine with that. So I think this is a very U.S.-China issue. My own view is it's tragic in the green space because the U.S. and China were on a path for a while to try to cooperate on climate. John Kerry has continued as an ambassador for the United States, continually trying to work with China on various pro-mitigation adaptation. China itself is doing a huge amount internally. It's a very mixed thing. They continue to build coal plants at a rapid rate. On the other hand, they're moving pretty much to a cap and trade carbon price for all of China, and it will have an effect. So, and they do have key parts of the green supply chain. And they do have, Tesla can say what it wants, but BYD is now the most efficient, productive scale producer of electric vehicles in the world. That's it. Okay. So I really think the U.S. needs to be a little. I was going to raise a question to you. So you said Lincoln was there, Yellen was there. Inside the White House, inside the administration, the NSC hawks dominate economic policy towards China. They dominate it. And so Janet will try to give a speech about balance, saying we have to balance the economic interests with the geopolitical interests. That's what her speech said. That's the same week that Jake Sullivan gave the speech, which pretty much said, forget it.
Yeah.
We're not balancing. We're basically keeping China out. And it's said regularly, and I'll say it even though it's regular, it's a truism. It is one issue where the Congress and the president, the hawks, agree. This is a very anti-China moment in the United States. And so we are willing, I think, to make bad economic decisions for the reason of what we want to do vis-a-vis China. Bad economic decisions.
Yeah, I'm going to want to switch gears back to maybe a more cheerful, maybe less cheerful, U.S. economy, where I think that the NSC or the national security folks are still dominating economic policy, more broadly than just US-China policy, but also on trade policy and other issues. But the US economy has, notwithstanding the latest this week's GDP numbers, been very strong. And in a way, a mirror of China. Americans love to spend, they've had jobs, had money, been spending, and that's been keeping the economy going. Liaquat, is that going to go on? Can it go on?
Yes. I mean, first of all, I think the boost to economic growth here was very much driven by fiscal policy. And I think we're seeing some of the repercussions of that. So you've got strong, the number yesterday was actually quite strong. Real final sales were above 3%. Private investment was strong. The negative was what happens when one of the sort of side effects of expansionary fiscal policy, which is trade, starts going against you. Yep. And what happens is you have an expansionary fiscal policy, it causes your exchange rate to appreciate, which then hurts your exports and encourages imports, which subtracts from the growth. So I'm very convinced that we have a growth engine that was given a sharp boost by fiscal policy and has been reinforced by a private sector investment boom. And that, as far as I can tell, is going to continue for a while. So I'm not concerned about growth. I am concerned about inflation because that does not seem to be, that seems remarkably resilient, and so
in a bad way.
So I don't quite know what the Fed does. They certainly are not going to ease. If on top of that you get the sort of reaction in the long end of the market that I was earlier predicting, I think that poses a real dilemma for the Fed.
John, on inflation and the U.S. economy.
Yeah, I'm perhaps just a little switch more optimistic than Liaquat. He's certainly right about fiscal policy, but I think it had a different character than we are used to thinking about. The big boost was COVID, and what it was the federal spending was replacing income that had disappeared suddenly because of COVID and the shutdown. So it wasn't it wasn't larded on top of a regular economy. It was a completely novel situation. And so I always thought from the start that this was not going to be viewed as such expansionary in the conventional way, again, because it was in the context for which we had really no precedent, in which there's this giant shutdown of sectors of the economy and folks were given support. I'm intrigued at the notion, I'm sure there are going to be I hope there are going to be a whole bunch of PhD theses looking back at the difference, whether the difference in the way Europeans approached support in COVID versus us, in the sense that in Europe there was tremendous support for firms and allow them to keep workers to keep a linkage to their firm, with the idea they should be confident that when all this comes to an end, they can go back to their old jobs. Versus here, where it's much more skewed to providing income for individuals, rather than saying your job is waiting for you. And maybe that has helped restructure things as we rebuild and give us, not magic, but given us a little edge in terms of productivity. And in that context is associated with strength in business investment right now. And if you're going to get productivity growth, that's how you're going to do it. So that's all to me pretty positive. As far as the fiscal impulse, our deficit is way high, right? And we can have a debate whether that's really good for the long run. But in the near term, I think the fiscal impulse this year is zero.
Yeah, it's nothing. Yeah.
So what's happening is let's call it more organic. And as for inflation, of course we all know what you saw had a huge response to distortions in the economy because of the shutdown, huge demand for goods, big in a constrained delivery environment that caused an increase in inflation. And we've seen a rebalancing against the service sector that you would think is always going to be a bit slower. But I've never quite understood the idea that inflation is going to be so sticky. It's come way down, and the PCE deflators come way down. And I think weren't we getting PCE numbers today?
Yeah, we did. They weren't great.
They weren't. But I was going to say they weren't supposed to be. They weren't
supposed
to be great. They weren't supposed to be great.
For the fourth month in a row.
No, granted. But if I had to bet, I bet that the next year is going to see somewhat slower growth, somewhat slower demand growth, and lower inflation.
Great.
Just
go ahead.
on the fiscal response to COVID, I think was overdone, and in particular, the last boost, which was the beginning of 2022, we did exactly.
Yeah.
But in Europe, it's certainly what's happening in the US certainly looks attractive. I want to give anybody who wants to ask a question a chance, but before that, get a quick response on, Liaquat says Fed certainly isn't going to ease. In your scenario, maybe the Fed will ease as the economy slows and so on. The markets very dramatically repriced from, I don't know what they've been drinking over the holiday period, but they came into the year thinking 6, 7 rate cuts, and now it's down to 1 or 2, starting later. But where are you on that?
Oh, first of all, I'm always mystified by this obsession with the Fed. The Fed the Fed is interesting. Central banks are interesting when they're trying to be extremely accommodative or extremely restrictive. Otherwise, these guys are following the data. So if the data shows us that the inflation's coming down, they're going to ease because they're, in the long run, they themselves say 5.5% funds rate makes no sense on an equilibrium basis, on a long-term basis. And if inflation doesn't come down, Liacat's got it right, and he often is, then they're not.
Liaquat.
Well, I think that now the game has moved to the long end. I think the long end is going to start. What the Fed does is sort of, I mean, I basically agree with you that they're going to follow on. But if the long end starts doing what I'm suggesting, which is we get a spike up in long rates, because they've suddenly realized that, I don't know, 4.5% or below 5% long rates that just make no sense, then I think that's what's going to drive, if you like, our view of the tightness of monetary policy.
And it's interesting because we may be into a period where Europe is actually going to move ahead of the Fed if they dare to, in terms of lowering rates. So
Can I
just,
raise-
yes, of course.
In response to this and thinking about the long rate, I just want to point out that maybe you got it right, but that whole decade where that Bernanke could not figure out and would give all of these speeches about why was the long rate so low? Why? And I don't think we have, just like we don't necessarily have good theories of inflation, I don't think we have any good theories about long run interest rates either. I want to link this a little bit since I did the outside risk here. I just want to come back to this because China holds a lot of reserves. That's a weapon that could affect this long rate.
Mhm.
Okay. On the other hand, a lot of the demand for U.S. securities really comes, bonds, government bonds in particular, comes from the rest of the world. So as long as the U.S. continues to be like the safe, liquid market here, there's a lot of savings in the world, and a lot of savings in the world may actually continue to flow into these long-term kinds of instruments. So that I think we should add to the picture. So we might have China unloading some of them, which I hope. And then I guess I really want to go back to what I said at the beginning. I don't think the inflation outlook over the next several years depends upon who is the president. Because
You don't think?
no,
do
depends on
think.
who is the president.
Okay.
Because I do think the independence of the Fed matters, and I do think a massive slap on the board, across the board tariff increase for the world, which will end up retaliatory. There'll be retaliations. That's going to be a slowing of the global economy, a slowing of the U.S., and a boost to inflation. So I think
So we have to hope that doesn't come about.
I'm just saying that it's hard for me, therefore, to kind of understand why the financial markets they don't seem to be pricing in that kind of risk. Maybe, by the way, if you're totally cynical about this, and I would be somewhat cynical, the financial markets figure they'll get, in the case that I'm talking about, where you get more inflation and you get tariffs, yeah, but you also get a lot of deregulation.
Yeah,
We can do whatever we want, and you get the tax cuts that you want to keep.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's it. Financial markets care about those things. It doesn't matter to them, the rest of this stuff.
Yeah, and you get, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is currencies, and the dollar will strengthen. We see the yen is coming back. Used to be the economy that everybody. Can I just see if there are questions? I don't know if there are questions online, Nina. No, and is there? Yeah, Asane.
You've talked about a lot of very important parts of the world. I'm just curious what you will think about Japan, because we've all lived through the cycles in Japan. And remember that they had their high, what was it, more than 20 years ago in terms of equity markets? And then they just reached that high again a month or two ago. They also have one of the best performing equity markets, plus 14 trillion sitting in bonds and cash and negative to very low earning assets. By the way, the Europeans also have, it seems, about 8 trillion of savings in very low earning bonds and fixed income. So the question is, in Japan and in Europe, could we have a momentum impact as even a few percentages of local money moves into their own local equity markets?
Liaquat, let's.
Yes, I mean, in a word, because their equity markets are remarkably cheap compared to this market. So yes, I mean, I think that's true. Just to cycle back, why did the long end hold in so well in the early, both starting actually probably in the late 90s. And I think it was,
right, that's when it started.
it was
Yeah.
Asian central banks.
No one knew.
Everyone was trying to support their currency, and that was causing them to not support their currency. They were trying to prevent their currencies from going up, and that was caused them to build up their reserves. And that was a major factor, I think, why the long end was so underpriced. And then you move into the QE era, and the Fed was doing their job for them. Neither of those two agents are now involved. So I think the long end does not have a great deal of sponsorship. What is happening to global savings that are coming into this country? I think they're going into the equity market.
Right now they're going into the equity market.
I mean, that's
That's correct.
the whole
Yeah.
sort of dynamic has changed. So,
John.
Yes, and what also happened starting back in the 90s is the percentage of GDP going to corporate profits took a step up and has held that high level ever since. Which is why the old ideas of fair pricing in the equity market have to be readjusted. And now the critical question is, can we, with all this investment, are we going to sustain these high margins? And if so, the equity market's going to stay attractive. With regard to the long term, I mean, all this reserve stuff is important in terms of currencies. I put it this way, I don't recall seeing the long end of the U.S. Fixed income market driven by foreign investors in defiance with local fundamentals.
Right.
Okay. And so once again, to me, it comes down to what's your outlook for long-term inflation here? And we're not.
You have a
we're not
difference,
sure.
we have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of not understanding what's happened and why, and a difference of view here. John, I want to allow you to go on, but also to repeat Afsane's question about Japan.
Yes.
And there's another potential bright spot in a different part of the world, which is India. So if you have any comments on that, please mention it.
And I'm just back from a trip to Japan. The part that is striking right now is the currency. That it's what is it, 157?
157,
something,
158, yeah.
Knocking on 160. So, just grosso modo, that means that Japanese consumers are losing real income, but it also should be boosting inflation and increasing Japanese external competitiveness, because by any measure, this is really outsized.
Yeah.
This is a change in the real effective exchange rate of some consequence, and it seems to me that the conventional wisdom is continued very, very slow growth, but better than it had been. But again, this is the only country that we've seen, the industrial country, where we have had and will continue to see a decline in the labor force. And in Japan, that's, as I say, it sort of looks like Florida, and it's gonna keep
Not
going.
in a good way.
do you agree the equity market is still underpriced, despite going up so much?
I would, well, that's your department, you're much better at this than I am, but my tendency would be, yeah.
Especially in dollars, as the yen has been weakening.
Yes.
Liaquat.
No, that.
Japan, India.
India. God, you're touching a nerve there. Look, India is an economic powerhouse, or not a powerhouse, but it's powering along. The growth is very concentrated in very few hands. I think they've got a major long-run employment problem, that this is jobless growth. But you just go there and you look at the number of unicorn companies that are having IPOs. You look at the Modi has done an outstanding job in getting infrastructure investment going. So I think it's a story of it's got momentum for the next few years. I just don't see that solving the underlying problem of income in India.
John, and then
Yeah, India is a very complicated place, right? But one of the big picture items, seems to me, is that they really, by our standards, haven't had a real national economy. They've had a lot of regional barriers, and what the current government is doing, among other things, the infrastructure is creating a national infrastructure. Their reforms are oriented toward breaking down regional barriers and creating a real national economy. And the level of income is still very low compared to. So my conclusion is, if they can keep reasonably good policies, this place has got a long way they could run.
The dilemma is that sort of labor-intensive export growth, which got all of East Asia going. I think that game is over, and India hasn't quite discovered what the next game is going to be.
very interesting. So I want to do a lightning round. We have just a couple of minutes, and maybe ask you to give what is your one best, most hopeful thought, or if you prefer, as we're all economists and that's the dismal science, what is the thing that you want to leave people most looking out for as a concern? But we could try some optimism as well. Laura.
All right, well, I've been the most negative here, and I stand by all my negative comments. But I will add a positive, and that is it's a potential. So I've been involved in a report that's going to come out relatively soon, sorry, very late, National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And it is about the effects of AI. And I did a report in that, a chapter in that, on the productivity effects. Now, here's what I'd say. It's a very simple calculation. If you think that half of the tasks in the economy can be affected are exposed to AI, either exposure means people no longer do those tasks, or people actually do them even better. That would be the augmentation effect. So let's say 50% of tasks are going to be affected. The case studies, and here's the problem, there are not many case studies here, suggest that, well, you might actually get a 20% productivity gain. Well, 50% of the tasks in the economy with a 20% productivity gain, that would be a very significant productivity effect for the US economy. And so the AI optimists, and my co-author Eric Brynjolfsson is one of them, would absolutely say we're sitting on the precipice of a major productivity boom, just like we did in the late 1990s. It may not last that long. It may be something like, the late 1990s, lasted less than a decade. The productivity boost. We'll get it. The thing that may slow that down is that organizations, including this one, have to figure out how to redesign their processes and their structure so that they can most efficiently use AI. So AI is a tool, and it needs to be used by an organization and by people in the organization. So that productivity effect may take longer to play out. So that those big numbers, but it might take several years. Because if you look right now, there's still not that many jobs being, Stanford does an AI index. You could read the AI index. It's not taking a large number of tasks right now, and it's not taking a large number of organizational redesigns, but maybe over the next 3 or 4 years. So
it will. So that's your great.
Can I just piggyback off that? I think a productivity boost from AI of the sort that we got in the late 1990s is likely, and I'm glad to know someone did some work to show that.
Terrific. We just want to think about how the gains are spread, and the US is
And for those that don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but it strikes me that the hallmark of the industrial era was that machinery made weak people strong. And the hallmark of the technological era is that technology will make stupid people smart. And
okay.
Let's hope
And
so.
smart people smarter. Thank you very much, all of the panel, Laura Tyson, Liaquat Ahamed, and John Lipsky, and to all of you and all of you online. Thank you.